Hello and welcome to Jack the Reader. This is my first video made really as a test or experiment to see if I can produce content for a booktube vlog. Hopefully this isn't too embarrassing to me on watching it back, and if so I'll be churning out more, which I hope to do. I've always enjoyed booktube vlogs and was finally inspired to have a go at it myself after watching a lot of popular booktube personalities, including one called Criminoli, a link to whom I'll include in the description. Like Criminoli, I enjoy crime and horror fiction. I recently completed a reread of the Ripley ad, a series of 5 novels by Patricia Highsmith about bon vivant conman and murderer Tom Ripley. The first book in the series, The Talented Mr. Ripley, published in 1955, is likely most famous for the film that Anthony Minghella made of it in 1999, with Matt Damon as Tom Ripley. The book that you saw at the start of this video is my copy of Ripley Underwater, the 5th and final book in the series, published in 1991. Before I get to that one, I'll just give a brief overview of the series and its author. Patricia Highsmith is one of my favourite writers, and at this point I've read nearly all of her books. Born in 1921 in Texas, she wrote psychological thrillers, often about disturbed or existentially troubled young men. The Talented Mr. Ripley was one such book in this line, about a young man in New York, Tom Ripley, who, as the story opens, is approached in a bar by the father of Dickie Greenleaf, a prodigal son and playboy living an idle life in Italy. Dickie's father hires Tom to convince Dickie to come home, and from there a story of murder and obsession unfolds as the sociopathic Ripley comes to crave the easy life that Dickie has. 15 years later, in 1970, Highsmith would continue the series with Ripley Underground, and from here the novels adopt a similar pattern. All revolve essentially around Bellombre, Ripley's French estate, bought partly with the proceeds of Dickie's will, forged by Tom. Another source of income is an art forgery scheme that figures as a recurring element from underground to underwater. The scheme, masterminded by Tom, involves a dead British painter called Derwent who committed suicide in Greece, but whose friends continue to benefit from the sale of his art and brand. Following Underground are Ripley's Game and The Boy Who Followed Ripley, respectively about Tom orchestrating mafia hits and a young man from America who seeks out Tom because his guilty conscience makes him see the older man as a kindred spirit. Finally, in Ripley Underwater, published 36 years after The Talented Mr. Ripley, but set only about 15 years after the events of that novel took place, we see Tom Ripley tormented by a couple of new neighbours at Bellombre, David and Janice Pritchard, a psychotic nightmare of a couple who play pranks on Ripley, like calling him up and pretending to be Dickie Greenleaf. The title of the novel refers to what becomes their ultimate mission, which is to drag the local canals for the bones of a victim of Tom's, killed to prevent the exposure of the art forgery scheme. I avoided reading Ripley Underwater for a while, just because it seemed like it was in an unfortunate tradition of crime novels, whereby the writer has continued writing past the point where they should have stopped. The best example of that would be Agatha Christie, the British Queen of Crime, who kept writing into the late 1960s and early 70s, and whose last handful of novels tend to be nigh on incomprehensible at times. I remember one which ended with the bastard son of Hitler, branded with a swastika on his ankle, becoming a church organist in an English village. Don't ask. The Amazon reviews of Ripley Underwater were largely what confirmed my suspicions, with a lot of 1-star reviews complaining about the lack of plot and unbelievable aspects. However, I'm happy to say that although the lack of plot is definitely a feature of Ripley Underwater, the novel as a whole is one I enjoyed, largely because of the Pritchards, who are a couple of the most fascinatingly repulsive and pathological characters that Highsmith ever created. There's a line late in the novel where Tom describes them as being straight out of Krafft-Ebing, referring to the German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who in the late Victorian era wrote a study of sexual orientation called Psychopathia Sexualis, a book which coined the terms sadism and masochism. There's a quietly disturbing early scene in the book where Tom tries vainly to reason with Janice Pritchard, who flits between seeming like a victim of and an accomplice to her abusive husband. She admits that he beats her, but exists in a weird sadomasochistic tension with him, and on trying to appeal to Tom's sympathies as a part of what is clearly a game to her, snaps and declares, "Oh, Mr. Ripley, I could have liked you." I was reminded of a book of short stories that Highsmith wrote called Little Tales of Misogyny from 1977, satirising certain female stereotypes with titles like The Fully Licensed Whore or The Wife. In Janice's case, the story might have been called The Battered Wife. What Highsmith does in the novel is what she does in all of her Ripleys, which she described as making the reader revel in the triumph of evil over good. She makes you sympathise with Ripley, and although she does that a lot more bluntly here, just by making the Pritchard so weird and reprehensible, it's still effective. David Pritchard is the prodigal son of a lumber magnate in the US, although unlike Dickie Greenleaf, he's anything other than a charming playboy. Ripley speculates at one point that there may be some ugliness in his past, such as the torture of animals, a habit commonly associated with psychopaths. And certainly, although Pritchard is the one trying to expose Ripley as the murderer that Ripley absolutely is, at one point correctly referring to him as a snob crook, Pritchard is definitely a psychopath, and an extremely obnoxious one. I can't exactly say that Ripley Underwater is a masterpiece, or even as good as any of the preceding Ripleys. It does have a very vague plot, a lot of which seems to be taken up with regurgitating the plot of Ripley Underground, to which this one is a direct sequel, as it involves many of the characters from the art forgery scheme begun in that novel. It probably helps to have read Underground before you start this one, but given that this was Highsmith's penultimate book, and arguably the last one she finished given the unfinished quality of her true last, Small G, A Summer Idyll, published in the year of her death, 1995, Ripley Underwater for me was an engaging piece of work. There is a chilling quality to how Ripley resolves the problem of the Pritchards, which doesn't involve direct violence so much as just a general ruthlessness in exploiting fate. So if you're a fan of Highsmith, I would definitely recommend this one, if you haven't read it already. Although if you're new to this author, I recommend beginning with The Talented Mr. Ripley or one of her other early titles. And that's my review. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments how I did, whether you enjoyed this little review, and I hope to make another one like it. Toodle pip, readers.